Today I'll be talking about rule number 18 of the rules of the road. Rule number 18 talks about responsibilities between vessels. Now if you think about it, that most of the other rules for vessels in sight of each other deal with encounters between two ordinary power-driven vessels. Rule 18 tells you what to do when you encounter a vessel that is fundamentally different from your own. It basically lists the various classes of vessels in kind of a pecking order of privilege. Because vessel classes perceived to be more maneuverable and directed to keep out of the way of classes thought to be less maneuverable. Naturally, there are several exceptions in the rule because perceptions do not necessarily hold true in reality. Remember that this rule applies only to vessels in sight of each other. The vessel directed to keep out of the way must follow Rule 8, that is action to avoid collision, and Rule 16, that is action by a giveaway vessel. The rule starts by saying that except where rules 9, 10 and 13 otherwise require. So rule number 9 refers to narrow channels, 10 refers to traffic separation schemes, and rule 13 refers to overtaking vessels. Now rule 18 does not apply when a rule 9, 10 or 13 requirement would conflict with the rule 18 requirement. So for example, let's say a sailing vessel is overtaking a power-driven vessel. It must keep out of the way, even though rule 18 says that power-driven vessels are required to keep out of the way of sailing vessels. You will see that later. The rule 13 of overtaking in this case will then take precedence over the rule 18. So rule 9 and 10, among other things, direct sailing vessels, small power-driven vessels and fishing vessels not to impede the passage of a larger vessel confined to a narrow channel or narrow fairway or using a traffic separation scheme. Under rule 8, these rules 9 and 10 continue to be in effect after risk of collision arises, at which time the rule 18 provisions favoring sailing vessels and vessels engaged in fishing would also place the duty to stay out of the way on the impeded vessel. So both vessels are now charged with staying out of the way. Rule 18 basically discusses 7 different vessel classes, that is power-driven vessel, not under command, restricted in ability to maneuver, engaged in fishing, sailing, constrained by draft, and a seaplane. Rule 18 Part A basically says that a power-driven vessel underway shall keep out of the way of a vessel not under command, as you see in the picture, a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver, a vessel engaged in fishing, and a sailing vessel. Now, ordinary power-driven vessels that are underway must stay out of the way of the other types of vessels because an ordinary power-driven vessel is more maneuverable. It has engines ready, steering going. Power-driven vessels that are not underway, so if they are anchored or aground or made fast to the shore, or their engines have failed or rudder has broken, then of course they do not have to keep out of the way of the other vessels, because in that case they cannot take action. All right, so it's common sense. Vessels that are anchored or aground then must display the required lights and shapes for those situations. All right, so that sometimes when you look at an anchored vessel, not sometimes, but whenever you look at an anchored vessel or aground vessel, then you should be able to say that it's an aground vessel, and you automatically know that the aground vessel or anchored vessel cannot take action to avoid collision. So it becomes your duty on the power-driven vessel or an ordinary power-driven vessel to stay out of the way. Rule 18b talks about a sailing vessel, and sailing vessels that are underway must stay out of the way of vessels not under command, restricted in the ability to maneuver, or engage in fishing. So what are each of these vessels mean is of course classified in rule 3, and I'll cover that some other day as to what is the meaning of a vessel not under command, and what is the meaning of a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver. All that is covered in rule number 3. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about what is the meaning of underway some other time. All right, we move on to part C of this rule. So in part C, you can see vessels engaged in fishing, especially when underway, must keep out of the way of vessels not under command or restricted in ability to maneuver. But the words that you have to notice here is so far as possible, because some fishing operations so severely hamper a vessel's ability to maneuver that it would be physically impossible to keep out of the way of the other vessel. So you can see here that this fishing vessel is basically using purse seine gear, and then it's difficult to move at all while it's drawing in its net. So rule number 18 certainly does not require that a fishing vessel will cut loose its gear in order to move out of the way of another hampered vessel. And that's why maybe if you have been sailing, you can see all these fishing vessels normally do these operations in clusters so that it's easily identifiable by the other vessel, but not necessarily, not always. But many times these fishing vessels are engaged in purse seine operations by their own, but they operate with such bright lights, and as you can see on the card here, that you will immediately understand that this vessel is hampered in her ability to maneuver, and then you on the power driven vessel can then take action. Vessel restricted in ability to maneuver and vessels not under command are given kind of an equal status. So all vessels under normal circumstances are required to stay out of the way of these two vessels. So what will happen if a vessel not under command encounters a vessel which is restricted in ability to maneuver, or if both belong to a not under command class, or to both are restricted in ability to maneuver, then both should take action to avoid collision. All right. I move to rule 18 part D. Now in paragraph D, rule 18 concerns vessels constrained by draft, as you can see in the card here, to a relatively narrow natural or dredge channel. If a vessel in such a situation turned off its course, it would run aground. Predicting the action the rule requires of a vessel constrained by draft is uncertain, so the formal concept of a vessel constrained by draft was not adopted in inland rule number 18. So for inland vessels, this rule is not adopted. However, the international rule requires that vessels, except those which are not under command and those restricted in the ability to maneuver, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid impeding the safe passage of a vessel constrained by draft. So the general requirement attempts to resolve a situation that varies greatly with particular circumstances. So as a result, there are two problems with the requirement. First is the clause, if the circumstances of the case admit, relies on the judgment of the navigator or the operator of the vessel approaching the vessel constrained by the draft. Now this introduces uncertainty on the part of the constrained vessel because the other operator's judgment can only be guessed. The second problem lies with the phrase shall not impede the passage. So basically it places responsibility on the non-constrained vessel to stay out of the way while it is at long range. Now, notwithstanding that obligation, if it gets close enough for risk of collision to exist, the constrained vessel will be obligated to act according to the more general steering and sailing rules, which may make it the gateway vessel. So the non-constrained vessel will in all cases continue to be charged with staying out of the way. Alright, because you can see in rule 8F, it mentions shall not impede. Alright, so perhaps because of this uncertainty involved, the rule commands vessel constrained by a draft to navigate with particular caution, as you can see in part 2. This means that the constrained vessel must be ready to take collision avoiding action at all times, which for a vessel constrained by draft means limiting speed and having engines ready for maneuver. The last, I won't say it's the last one here, but 18E. This covers seaplanes. Now, seaplanes, as you can see in the image here, is hardly encountered by most mariners at sea. So basically this part directs seaplanes to stay well clear of other vessels if possible. Otherwise, a seaplane is to follow the rules as would a comparable power-driven vessel. While landing and taking off, seaplanes cannot effectively turn, but they can maneuver when they are taxiing in. Vessels operating in the vicinity of a seaplane taking off or landing should note as a precaution that during a high angle of attack phases of those operations, the pilot's forward visibility sometimes becomes completely blocked by the aircraft's nose. So in such circumstances, it is better for a power-driven vessel to also be aware of this and be prudent and take action beforehand to stay well clear of this vessel. The last part of this rule, which talks about a wing in ground craft, as you can see in the picture here, was added in 2001. So this part was not existing in the rules of the road before 2001. This included the wing in craft wing and ground crafts, and it says that when taking off, landing and in flight near the surface, must keep well clear of all other vessels and avoid impeding their navigation. This craft operating on the water surface shall comply with the rules of this part as a power-driven vessel. So this was added after 2001. It has been 18 years, of course, but why I mentioned this is because if you are reading the rules of the road from books, then be aware that this part was added after 2001. So if you are reading it from a book which was published before 2001, this part may be missing there, so you should not get confused. Alright, so I thought I'll just discuss this rule number 18 here. It's pretty straightforward actually. If you think about it, it clearly mentions which vessels should keep clear of which vessels, and provides kind of a pecking order in terms of maneuverability. So I hope this was good enough for your understanding for answering questions asked you in the orals exam, or as well as practical application at sea. So let me know through a like or a comment as to what you thought about this video. I look forward to your feedback, and I'll see you soon with my next video. Bye guys, study hard.